Good evening and welcome. It's wonderful to see everyone tonight, and it's been especially wonderful for me because I've seen so many old customers of mine that I haven't seen in many years, not to bring up myself too much. Anyway, I am a trustee of this wonderful library, and one of the many gifts of being a trustee was the chance to get to know Shirley Hazzard, our beloved former trustee. There are so many things to say about Shirley, and I know our scholars will be discussing them, but these are a few brief notes from me. Over the years, Shirley's brilliance and high sense of morality shone out, along with her reverence for books, and also the Society Library, where she was a trustee. At one point, in a fit of decluttering the library, one of our board members suggested we get rid of our old card catalogs that are in the reference room. Shirley was absolutely horrified and convinced all the board the catalog was indispensable, and I agree with her. Even though all the books are computerized now, I'm so glad they were saved, and I enjoy looking through them. Shirley remembered the library generously in many ways. She gave her beloved books to the library and remembered us generally in her will. And in addition, she left us all her royalties, which seemed to increase and get better. And tonight we are very lucky to have introduce and moderate Nicholas Byrne, who has been a big friend of the library for many years and has taught classes here. Nicholas Byrne is a longtime member of the New York Society Library, frequent teacher, has worked as a teacher and researcher on Australian literature for the past 3 decades, and is the co-author of the forthcoming companion to the Australian novel from Cambridge University Press. He teaches at NYU and is the author of many books and articles. And now let us welcome Nicholas Byrne.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Before making some brief remarks of my own, I'm going to just introduce the speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Jonathan Galassi, who has served as president and publisher of Forrest Carlson Giroux and is currently the chairman and executive editor there. He has edited and published poets at FSG since 1986, and most importantly for us, he is Shirley Hazzard's publisher. Edward Hirsch is a celebrated poet and tireless advocate for poetry. He has published 10 collections which have received awards, including the Delmore Schwartz Memorial Award, the Levon Younger Poets Award, the National Book Critics Award. I'm a member of that as well. He is also an editor of poetry collections and has published 6 books of prose, including most recently, and I can highly recommend it, he had a great event down in Brooklyn for it last month, The Heart of American Poetry, is commentary on the most essential American poems, the ones you know and the ones you should know. Library of America 2022. Edwards honors include a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Ingram Merrill Foundation Award, a Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor, the Prix de Rome, and Academy of Arts and Letters Award. He has been president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation since 2002. Lisabeth Jury is associate professor at Pratt Institute. She works on literature, aesthetics, film, and European philosophy. She was educated in the US and UK and taught for many years at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, where our featured speaker is also from, where she was in the School of Photography, and she was also on the board of directors of the Sydney Experimental Art Club Performance Space. Her most recent book is The Chastity Plot, out last year from University of Chicago Press. Her current project is titled She Did It in Her Sleep, Rape, Unconsciousness, and the Problem of Knowledge. And those 3 speakers will speak on Shirley, and then we will have Francesca wade in conversation with Brigitta. Francesca Wade is the author of Square Haunting, 5 Women, Freedom, and London Between the Wars, which was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize and shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature on Doctorate Prize. She was a recent Leon Levy Biography Fellow and is a current fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers down at the Public Library, where she is working on a book about her time. And the women we're honoring here tonight are one of the women. Brigitta Olubas is Professor of English at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. She published the first scholarly monography, is that monograph or monography? Monograph, on Shirley Hazzard's writing in 2012, and recently edited 2 collections of Shirley's writing, We Need Silence to Find Out What We Think, Columbia University Press, 2016, and Collected Stories out from Forest House and Giroux. She also publishes on the very, very important subject of Australian refugee and diaspora writing. Now, my own brief remarks. After reading Edith Wharton's first novel, The Valley of Decision, set in northern Italy, Henry James famously urged Edith Wharton to, as a novelist, do New York. And if any of you ever have time to read The Valley of Decision, you will see how opposite that advice was. Wharton memorably did so using her inside knowledge. Shirley Hazzard, as an outsider from Australia, from Mossman in Sydney Harbor, truly did New York in a compelling and inimitable way. Not least, as Jeanette has already mentioned, she, along with her husband, the noted translator Francis Stiegmuller, was a highly supportive member of the New York Society Library. And in 2012, she made one of her last appearances. She was standing over there, and she was still herself. She was older, but she was still herself, and anybody who was there know how powerfully herself she was on that occasion. She lived a truly cosmopolitan life, encompassing 4 continents, all of which appear. I have been the offender with that, so I will tolerate I am not going to be a martinet about that because it has been me at times, okay? Shirley Hazzard lived a truly cosmopolitan life encompassing 4 continents, all of which appear in her writing, from Sydney Harbor to Hong Kong, to Tuscany, Capri, and Posillipo, to the glass houses of Turtle Bay. Her life transited the great and terrible fires of the 20th century, but she is not just of her time. Younger writers, people who have matured in this century, are eagerly encountering her work today, and her writing not only lives today, but lives resplendently. Brigitta Olubas, her biographer, who we honor tonight, has also inimitably done New York. I have known, as Jeanette said, I have known Australians for 40 years who have come to New York and think they know New York. But Brigitta really knows New York, and she has thoroughly mastered the arcane codes and byways of the New York literary scene in a way that nobody else other than Shirley Hazzard has done. This has enabled her to bring Shirley, Francis, and their intellectual and social networks astonishingly alive. And many of you have read the rave reviews in The Guardian, in the New York Times, probably in the print edition the Sunday of the book review. It's already online. In the Wall Street Journal, there have been absolutely rave reviews of this book. Brigitta is a literary scholar herself. And I think she understands Shirley Hazzard's creativity, but also how she was an intellectual. And although she never received a formal degree in anything, how she was a sort of scholar. Brigitta has captured how Hazzard was passionate and ardent, both in her intellectual and emotional life, and she has produced a superb literary biography. And now, the first of our featured speakers, Jonathan Galassi.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be here in what I think of as the Shirley Hazzard room. We had so many events that involved her or featured her here, including the one that Nick talked about, which was, there was a little conference about Shirley, I think, and Shirley was not at her best in her life at that point, but that you never would have known it that night. She sat there and she got up and she said, I don't want to miss a word of what was being said about her. And then she got up and she gave this very long, complicated response that was incredibly brilliant. And it was a very moving last appearance by Shirley, I think. So I was privileged to work with her on 2 books, her book Green on Capri and The Great Fire. And this is a very typical Shirley story. Shirley, Francis Stiegmuller and Roger Strauss, my erstwhile boss, had a big fight probably in the 60s, maybe long before I was around, about Cocteau and Francis's biography of Cocteau, and somehow or other something went. He had been published by the FSG, and something went wrong, and Roger hurried up and published another book about Cocteau at the same time, and Francis they were outraged, and Shirley said, well, I'll never be published by FSG. But somehow things, Roger was no longer in the picture. Somehow we ended up being her publishers. And it was a wonderful education for me to be exposed to her. I had gotten to know her earlier because I was interested in translating Montale, who was a poet that she really knew by heart, as she knew so much, and she was extremely helpful to me. And so that was the beginning of our friendship. Was not about business, it was about literature, and literature was what made Shirley. Poetry was the most important thing to her. It's so fitting that we're here in this library because she was a reader above all else, and she was, as many autodidacts are, she was more Catholic than the Pope, as it were. She was more of a believer in literature than anyone, really. And then, after she unfortunately died, Brigitta showed up, and Nick said she knows New York. And she does know New York, but she knows it through her knowledge of Shirley, and she has understood Shirley in a way that is hard to believe, really. And I've said to her, I think Shirley would really approve of this book, and I think that's really true, in spite of all the revelations that she might not have been so thrilled to. I think Shirley was honest above all. And I think she would be very, very grateful and pleased, gratified to have been understood so deeply by Brigitta. And it's one of the best books I've ever worked on. I just couldn't believe the thrill of reading it. And I know you'll all have that thrill too. Thank you very much.
Shirley Hazzard was the most cultivated person I'd ever encountered. I'd really never met anyone quite like that. She was extremely ardent, but also reserved about her personal life. And I somehow had the sense, I'm not sure why, that she had made herself up. And now I know exactly how, from Brigitta's wonderful book. I mean, it's filled with revelations about how Shirley went about becoming herself. And I not only love the biography, but I'm now rereading all of Shirley's fiction. Maybe not her UN book, but I'm reading all of her fiction now with this biography in mind. I highly recommend it. I met her in the most wonderful way through her editor and friend, William Maxwell. And I adored Bill and Emmy Maxwell. I was close friends with them for the last 25 years of their lives. Basically, I met Bill and attached myself to him and wouldn't let go. And so every year Bill had a birthday party in Yorktown Heights. I've never been to a party like that where everyone actually wanted to be there. And they actually felt thrilled to be there, honored to be there. I went with two of my buddies, Alec Wilkinson and Michael Collier. And I remember the first time I met Shirley, Alec had driven Shirley from the Upper West Side to the party, and he was driving and he said, "Oh, look, Shirley, there's a Rolls Royce." And she said, "No, that's a Bentley." And he said, How could you know the difference between a Bentley and a Rolls Royce? He goes, "Oh, Francis and I had a Rolls Royce." It was from the royalties of the Owl and the Pussycat. So Alec told me that story, and then I sat down next to Shirley Hazzard. And Bill had said, "You might have something in common." And she began to recite Leopardi to me. I mean, anyone who, if you read the biography, you'll know this, but anyone who met her knew that she had an extraordinary knowledge for poetry and feeling for it, more than almost any poets that I know. And she started, we started talking about Leopardi, and she was reciting Leopardi. And I said, "Oh dear, this is now immortalized in Brigitta's book. It's a good thing there's such an age difference between us, because it just completely sends me when you recite poetry to me." It's like, oh dear. I didn't know that there was a 25-year difference between her and Francis. Otherwise, it might have been more realistic. But it wasn't. I said this, and I said, "It just sends me when you recite poetry to me." And she put her hand on my arm and said, "Oh, there's a lot more where that came from." It turns out there was, and then she started reciting Aragon in French. And this was the beginning of our friendship, and at every time I ever saw her, she recited poetry to me, and it just kept going. I mean, it wasn't just her knowledge of it, which was extraordinary, but her feeling for it, especially Thomas Hardy. And Brigitta writes about how powerfully she felt Hardy's poem After a Journey. So this was, to me, a kind of key to her inner life. Which was very, very, very ardent. And if most of you know her, you knew how proper she was and how well put together. But this fire through poetry, which was in her, which you could hear, was expressed. And then you can then see this I'm not going to talk about all her books, but you can see this in all of her books. There's a kind of leitmotif of not only the quality of the prose, but the references to poetry everywhere. And so if you'd say, "I really love the French surrealist Robert Desnos," Shirley would just start reciting Robert Desnos too. It was really, really extraordinary. But the main thing that comes through is that it was through poetry first, and then through fiction and through literature, was the articulation of her own emotional and intellectual life. And then probably underestimated in the making of writers is not that they want to express themselves, but they want to imitate what they so much care about. And she wanted to join a community. What was really striking to me about her, and Francis too, really, was that they were just what you wanted about literature, because they were in no way academic. They not only didn't have academic affiliations, they didn't have academic allegiances. They didn't think about literature that way. I mean, for her, for Shirley in particular, literature was a kind of felt life. And this kind of felt life, or way of articulating life, gave her own writing and her reading very much part of the same thing, the deepest kind of experience. And I think this is one of the reasons that her own reading is so continuous with her own writing, and why I believe we'll go on reading her work for as long as we can read. So, thanks.
Hi, thank you. And I'm one of the academics that has to be ushered in to make the non-academics look good. So my comments are, well, they have a title, on not apologizing for Australia. And I don't think you need a reason to celebrate this absolutely splendid little biography by my friend Brigitta. But my excuse for joining in here in New York is as someone who made the reverse journey from New York to England to Sydney and then back to New York. So that's the connection I feel to Shirley Hazzard, And the connection I feel through the phrases she uses in a couple of places. One, I think it's in Transit of Venus, the other in The Great Fire. The first is the reference to the brute fact of Sydney. And philosophers use this term, the brute fact, meaning this is the irreducible fact. You can't go anywhere further. That's it. My spade is turned. I can't go on. Explanations stop here. So the brute fact for her is kind of the absence of something more, I think, the absence of a certain kind of resonant event. And that's the experience that Carol Bell has. And which she expresses in one of her remarks in the novel. There was nothing mythic at Sydney. Momentous objects, beings, and events all occurred abroad or in the elsewhere of books. Sydney could never take for granted, as did the very meanest town in Europe, that a poet might be born there or a great painter walk beneath its windows. An absence of literary acknowledgement, of artistic resonance. The second comes from the experience of the very young Helen Driscoll, exiled at Wellington, New Zealand, another place that I know. Looking out from a bus, Helen is struck by the Antipodean tone of desolation. The path indistinguishable from all others, the wayside leaves flanneled with dust, the net bag, the walking into oblivion. End of quote. I also felt, as an expatriate in Sydney, the absence of the mythic, the touch of desolation. Until, of course, my son was born, and then it was all fine. I feel bad about that, and I can apologize to my Australian friends here. I feel a bit better sharing my estrangement with Shirley. Of course, the voice in the fiction that says Australia required apologies is not Shirley's. It's actually the grumbly voice of Professor Sexton Thrale, wonderful name. Thrale is pompous, snobbish, mean-spirited, and he dies as if he were a damaged object in a shop, his value now reduced. I think that's a kind of a wonderful dismissal of him. So cultural arrogance gets from Hazzard lower marks even than cultural ignorance. But cultural ignorance has a lot on its conscience as well. Crimes against imagination, against originality, are things societies as well as individuals can commit. Brigitta quotes in her 2012 monograph a description offered by Jonathan Galassi of Hazzard's sentences, their awareness of their absorption in the literary traditions that they honor and bring so vividly into the present. Galassi rightly acknowledges this writerly power, this relentless probing of feeling and character as something moral, a practice of moral knowledge and moral perception that we don't have simply by being born with minds and wills and bodies. The knowledge of good and evil isn't available in the Garden of Eden. It's not available to the innocent or to the stubbornly ignorant and complacent. I suspect that something of Shirley Hazzard's quarrel with her country of origin, a place that she was always careful not to call her homeland, arises from an Australian discomfort with moral seriousness, of the kind that requires the mediation of literature's layers and reserves and disclosures, its transmission of knowledge. Without a literary imagination, without being familiar with habits of serious thought and artistic traditions, moral perception may be closed off, it may be starved, or rather it may not have enough to play with or to play against. The touch of desolation, she suggests, is there in the landscape that hasn't been written enough about. The sensory impressions, which are genuinely there, of course, but have no echoes in the words of poets or the images of painters. How can you see when no one has been there before you, registering the density of time, the accumulation of experience? In Hazzard's novel of Naples, The Bay of Noon, the heroine Jenny, aka Penelope, speaks of her post-war return to London from South Africa as delivering a pleasure, an adult as opposed to childhood pleasure, a pleasure that the plants and seasons now responded to literature. That nature was not the sole index of age, that the rewards of one's surroundings were rendered in architecture rather than in the unearned prestige of Table Mountain. And I want to just allow you to think about the unearned prestige of nature. Let's put it that way. But do we need to rank our pleasures, to prefer the ones endowed with layering, associations, literary echoes, and voices? It is a tricky question. The possibility that Australia might require apologies, that there is something unearned about affection for its strangeness, its newly confident and pushy materialism and nationalism. It's a possible mix of the very, very old, the second-hand, and the new. Brigitta has been precise in reminding us of Shirley Hazzard's cosmopolitanism, her quarrel with the fetish of nations and nationalisms, a moral imperative, I think, that drives her attacks on the United Nations, and I think also her principled calling out of US policy in Southeast Asia, and her criticism of Cold War stupidities. Hazzard's politics are not conventional, and that's a bit unusual in the academic context, where most of our politics are pretty conventional. Her worldliness is earned and struggled for. It's not the simple accident of privilege or dislocation, not the luxury of mobility, which can, leave you with an education without really deserving it, since it was not simply born into, as a conventional education can be. Education of the feelings is something we often learn about in literature from, I think, an experience, not exactly Shirley's, but the experience of the provincial, the outsider. Since the provincial is traditionally the one who must fashion their own taste, must experiment with aesthetic judgment and moral discrimination, since those were not given as a cultural birthright. And I think it's interesting the ways in which Shirley, I wouldn't call her provincial. I mean, that seems, and what people have been describing, she seems like the opposite of provincial. But I'd like to think more about the ways in which she is different from the classic novelistic provincial hero, the Balzacian hero, the Stendhalian hero. But she also sought out displacement and sought it with great deliberation. Perhaps the preference for love affairs with married men is not unconnected to this desire for displacement, for being elsewhere, for being somewhere where you're not absolutely belong. Hazzard is a writer of many places, a cosmopolitan, an amused observer of the longings and self-deceptions that afflict all of us, not just those of us who have looked out onto Antipodean desolation. One suspects that for her, Australia was never a place that permitted vivid and particular feeling, not a home for sensibility or sensuality. It was a great nowhere. But some of us read Shirley Hazzard with memories of Australia and New Zealand. And for us, it is difficult to avoid discomfort. How can the place you come from be so disappointing, so unwilling to provide the pleasures that matter? Yet her quarrel with the vacancy of the settler colony is important. It is personal, as well as historical and political. I would even want to say philosophical. That's the beginning of my ongoing conversation with Brigitta. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you first to the three first speakers. So moving and exciting and wonderful, thank you. I'm looking forward to the rest of that conversation.
Well, thank you so much to everyone, and to Brigitta. It's so nice to be able to talk to you about this fascinating and illuminating book, which tells such a fascinating story of a life lived across continents and spanning the 20th century, and that manages so successfully, I think, to integrate your subject's life and work and unspool in such rich detail how intertwined they are and how they inform each other and of course diverge from each other in such intriguing ways. And I'm excited to hear you talk about it, and I know everyone will have many questions, so we won't go on for too long.
Thank you. I'm so pleased, and thrilled that you've given up your own, as you all have, but very important work, and
not too important.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone will be just interested first, maybe to hear you talk about your first encounter with Shirley Hazzard and how this book really came about.
So in fact, my first graduate thesis was on Shirley Hazzard back decades and decades ago, when I was leaving the further province of Tasmania and moving to Sydney to go to a real university. In fact, my beloved sister, who died as I was beginning the writing of the book, sent me a copy of Transit of Venus in 1982 and said, "I think this was written for you." And it kind of was, you know. So I wrote my first graduate thesis on her. In fact, I wrote to her through that time because I heard she was coming to Australia to do the Boyer lectures, and I thought, oh well, I should meet her. And so I wrote a letter, which the archivist at Columbia has told me is there. So I'm a little ashamed of that. You know, and it was a gushing kind of, you know, I really love your work, and I'm a feminist, and you can see where this is going. And women and women's rights, you know, and
I'm sure she was thrilled.
and so I got a letter back saying, you know, look, well done, you know, good for you. I'm really not interested in academic criticism, and I'm not interested in feminism. And so you see, my dear Miss Olubas, I don't think there's any point in us meeting. You know, so it was like, you know, hilarious and incredibly gracious and all of that, but she really was, I had said nothing in my letter, on top of being an Australian, that made her want to meet me. So that finished, I went off and wrote a PhD on something else entirely.
Oh, wow.
And then The Great Fire was published, and I loved it and was disappointed by it as well, but mainly loved it. And I realised no one was writing on it. And then I looked and found that there was no academic criticism on her since the 1980s. There'd been a flurry by feminist critics and Australian literature, you know, the very people she didn't want.
She was putting them off.
Yeah, well, yeah. And so I started writing about it, and then started looking at her papers and found this extraordinary kind of world. And as I wrote the monograph, and then I started this, it was like going back 50 years in time, feeling like a scholar who had a responsibility to my subject. So I thought there were her beautiful essays, her non-fiction writing that had been published here and there. Wouldn't it be good if people could read them separately again? And Columbia were interested in publishing that, so I did that, and I'd found amongst her papers some essays that hadn't been published before, the lectures that she'd given the Gauss seminars at Princeton. So that went in, and that book was good. And then I spoke to Jonathan about editing the short stories. So that took some time as well. And then she died. But I did meet her a few times. I was coming to New York every year, every second year, and I would go and see her, and she was not really still with it. But I think she thought of me as this person who came occasionally and presented her with a book with her own picture on the cover. and you know, just as Jonathan said, she was delighted by the speakers here that night. What she actually said was, "Please speak up, I don't want to miss any compliments." You know, so it's like, you know, not just general things, but it was all about her. And so there was a kind of recognition there. And then that sense of responsibility led me to say, I think I'd like to do the biography. And it has been one of the deepest pleasures of my life. It's been just an absolute joy to read the immensity of her unpublished work and her informal work and her private kind of work, and to craft something out of that. So,
do you think she anticipated a biography or had feelings about it?
She kept things. She kept, you know, those revealing early diaries, you know, which are, you know, you look at Sylvia Plath's early diaries and they're beautiful, beautifully written, and you look at Shirley's early diaries and you think, how did this person become this extraordinary writer? Because they're not beautiful.
Wow.
They're very, a bit like my diaries of the same age, I imagine, really self-indulgent, you know, badly written, kind of just all about me and wailing and complaining. And within a few short years, she turns from that into this exquisite stylist, this great moral thinker, as Lisabeth's just sort of indicated. That was a really fascinating kind of...
And she used those diaries, right? I mean, you wrote about how she went back to them even in 2012.
Absolutely.
And I love the detail that she drafted, that you couldn't distinguish between her diaries and her drafts at some point.
That's less with those earlier diaries, and once she goes to Naples and suddenly the prose becomes beautiful, as she's got something more than herself to talk about, to write about. And she starts describing the city and her response to the city, and that sense of excitement at beauty and at detail. And she says something like, having all this, the luxury of all this lavishness to turn my attention to. So I think it was Naples really that changed her prose into something more formal.
Well, to go back to your process, this is an authorised biography. I'd be interested to hear what sort of sources. It sounds like the papers were already at Columbia, but I'd be interested to hear about the sort of support that you experienced from her friends, or in what way the research process was sort of affected by
so
authorisation.
That's been a part of a great gift of the process as well. Shirley was obviously a beautiful friend herself, a generous and exciting friend, and meeting her friends and talking to them about her. I mean, not only do all her friends, they write beautifully, they speak beautifully, they're really eloquent about her. And it was about a world that I knew nothing of. Whatever Nick says about getting New York, that was a long, laborious process. It's a long way from Sydney, a long way from Tasmania. So that side of it, and I just had extraordinary interest and support from her executor and Jonathan and so on. So I don't know, I'm possibly going off script here a little bit, but I had a hunch that they wanted someone with an academic, literary, critical background, perhaps, to do it, or they wanted someone who would pay attention to her writing above all. Even though one of those lovely reviews that people have talked about said, what a shock that an academic could write sensitively and accessibly about literature. And I think that's kind of what we do when we teach every day. That is the aim, as well as doing the other kind of writing as well. But that was what led to my sense of commitment and responsibility too.
But also, I mean, it's so hard for a literary biographer to track a subject's kind of intellectual journey, or a sort of an inner life. I mean, in her life, obviously, it was so storied and cosmopolitan and full of friends. But I guess what her reputation will rest on is these books. Which
yes, absolutely, and you would know from your work that the importance of that intellectual history, as it maps across the personal and the emotional and all of the other kind of chaotic. And it's just as chaotic too, and it's just as fascinating and as deep. So, but just I suppose in response to your question, Shirley's executor, Annabelle Davis-Goff, was just an extraordinary interlocutor about everything to do with Shirley, incredibly generous. So I, remain immensely grateful to her for that.
You start the book in 2003 with Hazzard winning the National Book Award for her fourth novel. Could you talk about why you chose to start here and what that kind of validation for The Great Fire meant at that stage in her career? Because I think, is it right that she'd somewhat fallen out of the limelight and at that point?
I think that's true. And biography as a form, I learned as I was writing this, it's quite kind of structured, Grandparents, well, that was kind of a bit of a vacuum as part of the darkness of Sydney, but the visit to the grave, the kind of contemporary moment, I've read so many biographies that in genre terms do that. But that's kind of because it really works, you need an immediate moment. You need to remind people of when the writer was most present. And she became extraordinarily present with that book. I mean, I was astonished at how many reviews I found that followed that line of, we've all been, waiting for the late, Shirley Hazzard's novel for 23 years. Really? I've been mourning by a shrine, and, few writers are worth so long a wait. And so there was this sense of just anticipation and ardour, long. So that shows both how much her readers admire and that sense of devotion that she inspires. But it also talks about literary publishing, or all publishing, things come in and out of style and out of favour. And one of the great pleasures of the last few years, and with the reissue of Transit of Venus last year, I think, seeing young writers and young readers, particularly women, but you know, young men as well, just over the moon, really excited at that book and what it does and how she did it. And seeing that across kind of new media and stuff as well is really lovely. So all of that meant I needed to start there, but it was such a special kind of event, and it was a bit of a gift having her and Stephen King, you know, in the same room, kind of having a conversation and all of that. And I thought, well, that scene wrote itself, you know. And then to go back from there.
Yeah, because it's also worked so well as a beginning, because it's also a moment where she started really talking about her past and sort of retelling the story of her life. And you write that from that point on, her work became a reverie and a revisiting of days.
Well, it was extraordinary reading the diaries of that period, because, I mean, it kind of happens. She's been writing that book since the late 70s. I think she got the title then. So all those things are kind of recorded that early. She knows, and back in the 50s, she had started writing about Hong Kong, and she'd sent that off to Knopf, and they said, not, you know, that's not working, but do write a novel about that, because there's something about that period. So she's writing, and she's publishing little bits of it here and there through the 80s, but she couldn't write about the love affair. And of course she met Verniapin again, and was disappointed in him all over again, and seeing how happy he was being a farmer, and, you know, I mean, that was never going to work.
Sliding doors moment.
Exactly. Yeah, well put. And she's sort of playing with it and but not quite writing it. And then she opens that diary, and there's just this overwhelming of herself and of the present with the past. And that's when she goes back and she annotates all the early diaries, you know, giving a later reflection on something, or she annotates all of his letters. So he's saying, you're so close to me, it's almost like I think of you as being in the next room, you know, which sounds like quite a romantic thing for, you know, your lover to say distant, separated. And she writes, "My God," next to it. "How do you think this made me feel?" You know.
Wow.
So there's this fury at that separation. That's kind of. So that was kind of alarming reading.
I mean, what an incredible document though, as
Yes.
a biographer
to have the past and the present.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And an interesting thing that I didn't write much about, but maybe someone can look at in the future, she's reading Iris Murdoch's Black Prince at the same time, and she is overcome with what she seems to be, feels to be parallels in the story, the novel she's writing, and Murdoch's. So they weren't apparent to me, so I thought I'd leave it out, but maybe someone will.
Still, that's an interesting convergence of sort of personal and literary and memory and reading.
And there was something about Iris Murdoch too. All her copies of Murdoch in her Capri library are annotated. There's this kind of conversation that she imagines between the two. So,
Okay. So I mean, that early relationship was obviously so formative to her, and I mean, going back to it, however many, nearly 50 years later, clearly was sort of, you know, both personally and, you know, for her work.
Yes.
So sort of influential. But more widely, what was the relationship between life and fiction for her, and how, as a biographer, do you deal with a subject who writes autobiographically, but clearly with, you know,
I think she doesn't write autobiographically. I think she draws on her memories to create scenes. And I mean, I was a bit overwhelmed as I started writing, thinking, God, how do I write about Sydney, the Sydney she grew up in, when she's described it so exquisitely? And then, you know, of course, I just use her writing to describe the Sydney that she grew up in, because who could do that better? So, I don't think she's writing autobiographically, except in that last novel.
Well, there's a quote I wrote down from you where you say we quote her saying, "Something that was very close to you and resembles your experience isn't necessarily the deepest version of the story."
Yes,
which seems to
is absolutely. And then she says something like, one feels for another person, one imagines. You know, there's this sense about empathy and about imagination and about, creation, and that's the work of fiction, which is what draws her in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I wouldn't say she wrote autobiographically, and I think she would resist that too. Yeah.
What about sort of self-mythology? I mean, how much of a kind of self-mythologizer would you say she was? Because there are points where you sort of differ from her interpretations of things, like the end of her engagement, for example. There are sort of various stories. I mean, were there other moments where you found yourself with your sort of biographical knowledge?
Well, where I couldn't find, even in her diaries, any account of things. And I think in particular with that last novel and that first love affair, there was such a gap and such longing. And she was very much a grieving widow, and reading those diaries during the pandemic in particular of her missing her husband, the extraordinary, and it's daily, it's every day, and it's overwhelming. So I think all of those things, make that a particularly charged rewriting of the past, and then she forgets what really happened. But another great relationship with her was Elena Vivante, her friend, the older woman in the villa outside Siena, and she goes back regularly and writes about Elena, and nothing changes there. That is absolutely from the first moment. There is this passionate embrace of this woman and her intellect and her spirit and engagement with the world and her life, and that stays the same. That doesn't change. So it's not something that she's going to rewrite as romance. So maybe
but
that's the secret of it.
You give such a good sense of her friendships and how sort of specific and important friendship was to her.
Hugely important, and lots and lots and lots of friends.
So many friends.
I mean, it felt important to me to try and make sense of her. I mean, a lot of the commentary says she's not nearly as well known as she should be, and I've speculated this is because she comes from Australia, but she's not really an Australian writer. She doesn't really belong to any particular period or time of writing. And part of the responsibility for me was to give a sense of the very singular kind of life that she lived and the circles that she mixed in, and that she wasn't really. So she was friends with New York intellectuals, but she wasn't really one of them. She was friends with other groups. She wasn't part of any literary scenes or cohorts or coteries, but she knew everybody and had these really rich friendships and really rich kind of conversations with such a range of people. And I wanted to give a sense of the breadth of that world and the diversity of that world over such a long period. So, that's...
Yeah, well, you do.
Good.
But I guess, you also give such a sense of her as an outsider, which has been sort of mentioned already, but I guess also really convey the importance of place. I mean, she moved between places so much, both as a child and as an adult. There were clearly places she was drawn back to, like Italy, where she kind of decided to be a writer, and Capri. And I wondered, how different you think she was in different places, or how important it was to her to be on the move.
Yeah, different in different places is kind of interesting. I think she performs Shirley Hazzard wherever she is, which goes down really well in Manhattan and really well in Italy, where she was, respected. And I loved reading and reproducing the stories about how, the guy in the tie shop remembers her, the local shopkeepers loved her, the way she hosted parties for her Naples drivers' daughter's graduation, and relishes in every moment of those. Yeah. So she really throws herself into all those different places. The only place where it didn't work was when she would go back to Australia, and her Australian kind of friends or audience just didn't know what to make of her kind of her formal self. Yeah. And that was always unhappy.
Yeah. I mean, how much would you say hers was a kind of Australian life? I mean, you write about how much she was kind of shaped by the legacies of racism, or you say she was unwilling to saddle herself with its colonial burden. So I wonder how you feel as well, sort of writing about her from Australia.
Look, she The Australia she describes is a really small part of even Australia of the 30s and 40s. It's the upper North Shore. It's a very Anglo, it's very white, it's very upper middle class, and very inward looking, well, in those years. So it's not surprising to me to read her say, I knew no one who read poetry for pleasure, I knew of no one who spoke another language. You know, and there was no culture and so on. But there was, you know, there were people writing and, you know, speaking other languages and that kind of thing. So she's got a very constrained experience of life in cultural life in Sydney. The same in Wellington. She's the daughter of the trade commissioner. You know, she's living in that kind of world. So it's a bit presumptuous of her to say that's all of it. And I suppose the other thing is Australia at that time, broadly across the board, there was no sense of the enormity of the First Nations cultures that had existed continuously for 60,000 years. And it wasn't just her, you know, upper middle class world that wasn't familiar with it. It was the whole culture. She was one of the earliest critics to start calling those things out and to start talking about the White Australia policy. And I suspect that's one of the reasons Australian critics have had trouble with her, not just because she was critical of Australian nationalism, but that she's very, very upfront about the White Australia policy as a plot device, even in The Great Fire. He won't Peter Exley won't take the Rita Xavier back to Australia because she would be treated badly. And I think that rankles with Australians, but it's true, you know,
and she
a
was
historical fact.
able to say it.
Yeah.
Believed it. And
Definitely. So, you know, there are a lot of factors at play there.
Yeah. What about her sort of professional sort of job life? I mean, the UN, and you know, and how does I'm interested in, you know, in writers with kind of day jobs or
the day job.
You know.
Yeah. Look, the diaries are full of, you know, accounts of conversations where she's, you know, sitting on her boss's desk, you know, talking about poetry and, you know, movie or theatre that they've been to see or whatever. Or, you know, other smart, interesting, cultivated friends that are working at the UN. And there's not very much mention of any typing or filing that, you know, she's meant to be doing. And there's that beautiful photograph that's in the book of her in that gorgeous UN suit, and she's sort of in profile and the lovely eyelashes, and she's painting her nails. You know, I mean, great photo, but she was surprised when really bad performance reviews came in regularly and she didn't get promoted. And it's like, they don't see my genius. It's like, you know, you're actually not working very hard, you know. And she didn't like it very much, but, you know, it took her to Italy. And
it enabled things.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and it, you know, introduced her to interesting people in particular but the work not so much. Yeah.
And what about her sense, how much of a sense of her sort of writing process did you get from the archive? And
I've written about, I mean, she's quite explicit about that with the writing of The Great Fire, and she talked about it a lot in interviews. Other than that, what you see is fragments, little moments that she describes here and there, and then she picks up on later and kind of expands on, which is, I imagine, what most poets and writers would do. You make notes and then they flower into something, or they don't, you know. So she, and that's, you know, why I made that comment about the kind of leaking between the diary entries and the fragments that clearly turn up almost intact, some of them in the novels. She seems to have destroyed all her early drafts, except for The Great Fire. We've got gazillions of drafts of The Great Fire, but they're all jumbled, so you don't know which ones are from the 80s, the 90s, you know. So I don't know if there will ever be kind of order restored to those. But all I could find of any of the other novels was a finished typescript. So she wanted, so the William Maxwell line that she came to us perfect, and, you know, which she kind of did, that's about hiding the drafts. But she did tell people that she did 20-something drafts of The Transit of Venus, you know. And there are drafts even of letters, you know, so she did 2 or 3 drafts of letters to people. And her letters are beautiful, you know, they're as crafted as the fiction is.
And we haven't yet, I guess, talked about her relationship and love, her great subject. And there's a quote that you quote from her saying, "The dream of love still supplies the poetry of all manner of unpoetic lives."
I think it's a really beautiful account of what poetry meant for her, and also why she keeps writing love stories. That this is something other. They give us access to something more than just sexual love, romantic love, more than just that feeling. That it is a way of being grander and truer and kind of more human, more significant. So there's that kind of heroic and aspirational thing that drives all her writing, all her political writing as well. And I'd put alongside that the one that she gives Aldred Leith in The Great Fire, where the experience of love is in itself aberrant. There is perversity everywhere in every love affair that she talks about. So she seems to be writing conventional romances, which she kind of is, but they are twisted and distorted in interesting ways everywhere. Yeah.
And what about the relationship with her husband? I mean, how do you think the sort of interplay between their work, how much of a burden on her is it?
She certainly put her work aside in the later years to help him work. He was losing his memory, was the way she always put it. She was concerned about it. And she felt that was really important. At one point in one of the many, many agonised letters about her mother, which is a kind of dark and darkly comic side of the whole thing. She says, my mother thinks that Francis and I are still 24, and she says Francis in particular has spent his life looking after other people, and now it's time for me to look after him. So there's this kind of conviction and sense of duty and responsibility. I mean, we can read it as a, that she was a very highly conventional woman who, as a young woman just wanted to get married and have babies. Like, that was not the Shirley Hazzard that you think of, but her diaries are full of, the married lover. I just want him to, divorce his wife and like, it's not going to happen. So she thinks she wants all of that. So there's that in there somewhere. But I think it's also this sense of writing is important work. He has been, noble in relation to his first wife, and I want to do that. But in the diaries also she really minds. She really minds that she can't have time. So it's intractable, isn't it? We all have responsibilities, and
Well, and that sort of tension, I mean, it comes out in her sort of young years, where she, I mean, on the one hand, maybe the sort of conventional sort of desires, but also in a way, it seems that much of her life is about escaping those scripts, or wanting to go to university. And how much she was self-taught really comes out.
Yes, too. Or the beautiful example Lisabeth just gave of, choosing adultery in order to kind of put yourself somewhere else. And somewhere else in relation to romance too, somewhere outside the proper. So there are these tensions, I suppose.
We've got one more question, then I think you want to read something, and then I'm sure everyone else has questions. But I was so struck by this quote from Patrick White, where he says, "To me, you do lead an unusually charmed life, writing away in the New York apartment and Capri Villa while collecting your celebrities and charmers and pairing them off around the world." Which, I mean, I wondered if you could sort of speak to that. Do you think she led a charmed life? Or?
She certainly led a charmed life, in the sense of marrying a man with both the sensibility and the wealth to... I mean, they lived as private scholars, basically, as independent scholars. Like, people weren't doing that even in those years. So they're both like throwbacks to an earlier time in that sense, having the luxury of that and the luxury of travel. And she's utterly aware of that all the time. So she lived a charmed life. Her response to that letter to her friend Elizabeth Harrell was, Patrick knows nothing about her life, and to Patrick, Francis Steegmuller replied, "But you are the greatest celebrity that we know." And Villa in Capri is 3 rented rooms in an ex-pensione, like it's, and they didn't own property. It was just the art. So hugely charmed, but not quite the Rolls-Royce story you know, yes, it was a gold Rolls Royce, and they did ship it a couple of times backwards and forwards. And Frances describes the pleasure of driving it at 100 miles an hour. You know, just how steady it handles it at 100 miles an hour. You know, they did that as well.
Yeah.
And Shirley said, you know, we could drive up to stately homes in England, and the Rolls Royce would just get us in to look at paintings. You know, so. Charmed life.
Well, I think you
Sure.
do just such a brilliant job of kind of conveying the charmedness and the kind of myth, but also, you know, undercutting it and
Thank you.
You know, prodding at the tensions that
Thank
lie
you so
beneath.
much. Well, she came from a pretty dark place as well. So we.
Yeah, well, that comes
I
through.
did want to read a little bit, and Elizabeth, could you just? I forgot to bring a book up with me, but it will be really quick. But I did want to give the last word really to Shirley. Oh my God, it opened at the page. So this is the first paragraph or so of the final chapter, which is called Sola Solissima. In February 1995, the poet James Merrill died of complications from HIV/AIDS. Shirley spoke at his memorial. Alan Gurganus wrote to her afterwards, "Being at James' place was rendered so much easier and more significant by your being there. I was so aware of our having so recently lost so much. We shall never see their like again. And yet, having known people like James, like Frances, justifies a lifetime of one's own attempts at writing clearly and living one's ethics. I found your presence so beautiful and consoling." Shirley's memorial began with a quotation from Merrill's poem 164 East 72nd Street. I find it quite hard to read this, sorry. "Do you ever wonder where you'll, oh my dear, asleep somewhere or at the wheel, not here?" She went on, "How strange now to know the answer to that question, Tucson, Arizona. James has departed with his quicksilver charm of speech and spirit, his face of a sagacious boy, a face lately like crinkled paper over fine bones, fanning into laughter. The quality of Merrill's friendship was her theme. She was honing now the language of loss and the sharp joy of remembrance. James, kind and candid, amused and so amusing, and self-possessed as a cat, an unexcelled yet mannerly intelligence. One felt that he understood everything, even the future, and he expressed the knowledge lightly so that we and he could bear it, that he remembered what was illuminating, lively and beautiful, and all that he had read." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigitta and Francesca, for such a stimulating conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
The lines that Elizabeth was citing about Sydney and Australia, I don't know what decade she wrote those in, but perhaps it was 70 or 80 years earlier that Henry James said exactly the same thing about America. Henry James also settled in Italy first before going on to Paris and London. Henry James also wrote a great deal about adultery and a lot from women's point of view. Did you find, did Shirley Hazzard feel any resonance with James's, either his themes or his succession of styles?
Yeah, thanks. She was often asked that, and she said, "Oh, look, I've written, you know, I came to Henry James quite late, and he's a wonderful writer and I admire him, but she found him kind of tight and restricted and so on. And she said, I also think I'm much funnier than him." So she really didn't like being asked about literary influences. That's part of that mythology, I think, of coming perfectly formed. Yeah. People would say, but you write so much like Patrick White. But she does. After she reads Patrick White, she writes A Transit of Venus, and a couple of people have pointed out just how much the shift in her style reflects that more grandiose kind of style that dominates his work. So.
Yeah, Jeanette, please.
We talk about Shirley having a charmed life, but do you think she ever wanted a more passionate marriage? She had this kind of spiritual relationship, and I saw their great affection for each other. And also shortly before she died, while she was showing me around her apartment, she said, this is the bedroom where the babies would have slept, but the babies never came. I mean, did she have a lot of regret, do you think, that she didn't have children and that her marriage wasn't quite passionate?
I don't know what her marriage was, you know, and I wouldn't want to kind of speculate on that. She did want to have children, and then she used to say that she and Francis would say, because they spent their evenings reading, you know, everything, you know, Shakespeare, you know, whatever, to each other. And after a particularly pleasant evening of reading to each other, Francis said something like, well, if we'd had children, we wouldn't have had these pleasant evenings, and she completely agreed with him. So, you know, I think she had the marriage that she really wanted, which had its complexities, but the deepest connection that they shared seems to have been this love of writing and reading and the necessity of it, and driving around looking at beautiful art and, you know, describing the light changing of, you know, her balcony in Naples, and that sounds like a pretty damn good life to me. Yeah.
Yes, Sarah?
One from the live stream. What was it like finishing this book during the pandemic?
Yeah, look, writing it during the pandemic was particularly grueling. I was kind of in lockdown for a year before writing, so that bit of it didn't change. I was here in 2020, March 2020, in the archives, and cut my archive trip short because I was worried the border would close, and got home just in time. There were some bits of kind of extraordinary doing the research during the pandemic. I was trying to track down some diaries that were, I think, in the Lilly archive, and you could book a Zoom session and the archivist would be there holding the diary with her white gloves, and you're reading it on Zoom and saying, turn the page, please. So that was kind of extraordinary. I think many people have really enjoyed made use of the time at home, the solitary time of the pandemic, to write and produce things. And the timing was kind of perfect for me. And it's really good to be able to leave the desk and leave my home and come out to the world now. So.
Any other questions? I would like to know if you have an opinion on why we've discussed a lot that young people are reading her today. And as a teacher, there are a lot of books I try to get younger people to read, and not everything takes off, but Transit in particular has really taken off the past 2 years. Any idea what in the book? Is it just that she's a good writer, or is there something more concrete?
I think it's that she doesn't write like anyone else. I mean, you know, there are connections that you can make, and I think there's excitement at that. I don't have an answer beyond that. You've taught it?
I have taught it
recently?
In April of 2020.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
on Zoom, at the early days of Zoom. Yeah.
And they read it?
They loved it.
Okay.
They loved it.
Okay.
I mean,
I'm inspired.
We have this. I mean, those of you who know Transit know that there's a real twist in the ending, which, if you read the book, becomes a twist at the beginning. And they were quite stunned by that. And those of you who've read the book know that it was a wow, because they were approaching this novel as a comparatively realistic chronicle of 20th century life. And then there is this narrative surprise. I don't want to spoil it for everybody, but there is an interesting narrative surprise in the book, and that did one.
And it's handled
Subtly.
impeccably.
Subtly,
Yes,
yes.
yeah. So, yeah, well, I mean, I would hope people would be able to teach her again, and it is really interesting in seeing that interest from young writers and young readers as well.
Wouldn't you say that in some ways the Transit of Venus is a novel out of a great tradition? It's
For sure.
like a 19th century novel in the 20th century.
Yeah,
Really.
and I think you've made that point, that she saw herself in those kind of terms as well. She was someone from and she really wanted to be considered in that kind of company
definitely.
Anybody else? Anything more from the live stream, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay.
We've got a vote here for publication of Shirley's diaries. Any chance that that's a project of yours?
That might be for someone else, another scholar to do. I feel really quite ready to move on to other archives and other things.
Absolutely. And an interesting question here that might be a good place to wrap up, or if there are others, that's great too. With such an intimate biography as this one, did you find it difficult to separate your own personal and emotional commitment to Shirley's life from the slightly more widely removed?
Yeah, I had no trouble at all. No trouble at all. I should say I went into this without a particular interest in her as a person or as a life. That wasn't something I found compelling, or even necessarily rich. I mean, I had heard from her friends how interesting she was, so I'm sure that was true. But it wasn't a life or a selfhood that particularly proclaimed itself to me. I loved the books. I loved the writing. That had engaged me from the start. But as I read and found the complexities and found one of the things that appealed to me about the writing was the way melancholy is woven into everything so profoundly, and finding the threads of sources for that melancholy in her life was quite moving. So yeah, that was the point at which she started to come alive to me as a lived person.
For me, watching you over the past 14 years, having first heard your paper in Wollongong on Hazzard, what I would say is you were always interested in her cosmopolitanism, and in many ways her cosmopolitanism was her life. So I think you were in a way interested in her life before you were interested in her life.
I'm sure you're right.
How different from my perspective, I would say that, yeah. Other questions or comments, anything else? Okay, thank you very much. And